Something happened with the live stream. Good. I'm typing furiously. Is my video up? Great. All right. I think we figured out some of these technical kinks. I believe that we're good to go and that we have video and audio at this point. But it is not on YouTube yet, which is weird. So let's reset this real quick. I'm gonna try one more time. All right, now we should be on. Are we all good? We have the YouTube, we have the... Cool. All right, gang. Let's do this. Here I am, and here's Max. Max, do you want to introduce yourself very briefly? Tell us who you are.
Yeah, sure. My name's Max Kaufmann. I live in Los Angeles. I'm from Pittsburgh. I've been making games since I was like 12 using BASIC in DOS. And we've been working together for several years on Solar Ash since the beginning of the project. I'm a computer programmer, and I've been doing a lot of the gameplay and sort of like animation, action handling for Solar Ash.
So when you say action handling, this is a great jumping off point. What does a senior gameplay engineer do day to day, typically?
Yeah. I mean, basically, we start from doing a lot of like prototyping because there's a lot of sort of like goals, aspirations, or like requirements that like sort of designers and directors have put together for how the game should like play and feel. And then sort of the like gameplay, like game engineering side of things is to actually like turn the words into reality. So like starting with prototypes and then later with like sort of regular builds that people are playtesting. We sort of, come up with all the mechanics on like how the input's handled, how the players move, how the camera is handled, how you like interact with objects in the scene and how things in the scene interact with you. And then basically just sort of like iterate to try and like, I don't know, create the gameplay. Because it's like, I don't know, it's like hard to make something from nothing. And so the process is just to sort of like iterate and figure it out like in the game engine. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen you do some pretty wild things in Engine. We're going to showcase some of that here. We have some old blurry GIFs for people to look at. But they showcase some cool stuff. And I think we can kind of use visual aids to talk about it. Let's go over to that view. I'll do my file share. All right. So we've been working on Solar Ash for a few years now, since late 2016 when we started doing some prototypes, and we've tried a lot of different stuff with gameplay, the character interacting with the environment or other enemies, and here we have our little grabber eel. You want to talk about what this experiment was and how we came to it as kind of one of our jumping off points here, Max?
Yeah, sure. So like kind of the creative vision for Solar Ash was like, I mean, as a player fantasy is to sort of create these like David and Goliath scenarios where like Ray, the protagonist, like she's very small, like relative to how big like the sort of monsters that she encounters are. But like her advantage is that she moves really fast, and so and like that she crawls all over their body. Um, and so like one part of that, you know, is like on the character side, like really pushing how fast we can make a character like go. Like, you know, at her sort of like regular dashing speed, she gets up to like 45 miles an hour. So that's sort of like one of the things we spent a lot of time experimenting with is just like how fast can we push that speed but still have good controls and still like create like platforming challenges that like people can get good at and they can master the controls and there's sort of like depth and a skill ceiling there. And then the other side of the equation are like the remnants, like the giant sort of kaijus that you encounter in the world. And like thinking about like how they move, how we control them, how we author them, but then also like how that interacts with the character's movement, how the character's movement interacts with their movement and stuff. So this is just like a sort of a quick prototype that we put together of like a monster that sort of pops up, sort of Jugfish style, like out of like this sort of lagoon of acid.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were thinking like at this time about like, you know, how do you frame something like this? Because it's pretty tall. It's like 5 stories tall. So like thinking about like how to comfortably look up at it because that's a difficult thing for cameras.
Right.
And
it's
then also
it's
thinking
tough to get players to want to look up also.
Totally. And then the other part of it with this one was just thinking about like because they're not just characters but they're levels, like we're sort of always playing this balancing beam of like giving them really interesting and evocative movements. Like this one's like clearly coming up and it's got its little roar and stuff, but then it also there is like a sort of smoothness to it, like in the attachment between its head and where its body goes into the lagoon, where like all those attachments are moving smooth enough that they can actually work as gameplay platforms, and that if you jumped up on there and you ran around on top of there, it would be like a stable surface, and the controls wouldn't suddenly become unpredictable once you're interacting.
So let's jump to the next one that we have lined up. Again, we've had a lot of different experiments over the past 4 years of development, and this one in particular was memorable because it was one of the big giant monsters, which, again, small for our scale of stuff in our game. Like this guy was, you know, definitely more mini boss size for us than boss size. Do you want to talk briefly about what's going on here and how it relates to some of the experiments we had early on? Looks like we got clouds in here. Looks like we got some chasing, and there's a lot of other interesting things about IK we can dig into. But like generally, you know, can you describe the process on this a bit and what's happening here in this scene?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so there's like a lot of like sort of like elements to break down, but so first there's the environment. It's all of those like teal shapes that are around you. That's sort of how we author the titular solar ash of the game. It's just sort of these big sort of clouds in space that the character sort of skates and skis around on. And like you actually like cruise even faster when you're moving through them. You can see she dips into them. And so we were thinking about like how to handle the controls on the clouds. What was tricky is that like with the clouds you go so fast and sort of your steering is sort of so loose that it becomes difficult to do tight platforming. And so we were trying to think about like how to create a scene that would focus more on like speed and not focus on like precision of trying to put the player in an exact place. And so this is just sort of one prototype of like, well, what if we sort of constrain the camera to a rail, kind of like in a racing game, right? Because like racing games are just about speed. And then make it sort of like a chase scene with this sort of big monster like remnant coming at you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And then you mentioned inverse kinematics. That's just sort of the highfalutin way Sci-fi way talk about like controlling a character like a puppet, where you're like moving the ends of their feet and stuff. And so we're also thinking about like animating characters sort of by like just like programmatically controlling their feet rather than just sort of like moving a capsule around.
You can see that in this one with this old scorpion prototype.
Yeah,
How the legs are moving, and that wasn't hand animated. That's driven by code, essentially, right?
yeah, it's all procedural locomotion. So one of the early challenges that we had when we were thinking about the game was just like we knew that we wanted to have sort of encounters with huge enemies, but it's sort of like you have one pipeline for how to make characters, then you have a different pipeline for how to make levels, and it's sort of unclear like, well, is this like a really character-like level or a really level-like character? And we decided, like, our opinion for production was that they're like big character-like levels, but they're fundamentally levels. So instead of building this character like in Maya and using animations like you would normally for a character, we just sort of took the Unreal level editor and sort of patched the engine and like heavily modified it to create big sections of the level that could be attached to essentially these puppets that had procedural animation. And you can think of their procedural animation as being like a bunch of like little animating things that work as a squad. Right. So like the tips of all the feet and the head and the tip of the tail are all sort of like creating hints that then this algorithm uses to convert into a pose that sort of obeys all the constraints of the character. Like how all of its parts attach together and how much different points of articulation can rotate and how quickly things can move, sort of speed-wise.
This was pretty deep into our project. It wasn't the first year necessarily. We can see that Ray has some definition on her that she didn't previously, so this is a little deeper in. I'm gonna pull back for a minute here and let me load up a different set, and we can dig into that stuff. So we had talked about the rig tool for a little while as well. Let's open this up. And 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, and we got we got the hot dog, the good old hot dog. This was very early in the process. This was like the first, handful of months that something akin to that we started looking at a lot of different aspects for the character. Climbing on a moving surface being one of our paramount features, and being a pretty challenging one at that. So maybe you could speak briefly to this happy hot dog moment.
Yeah, so like you can see in the scene, there's a lot of like bright colors and things, and that's just like because like early in a project, you're just sort of like focusing on the shape of collisions and like the different types, of objects, and so like we want to just sort of like know at a glance when we look at it that the blue stuff is like just sort of like solid, not moving geometry, but the pink stuff is like, oh, this is a thing that moves and it's something you can grip to. And at this point, we'd sort of like just sort of gotten the character control sort of figured out, and now we were starting to think about like once you have like you like not just having a character cruising around in the level, but you want them to be interacting with a big character, and so we're just like, if you have a really big character in the scene, like what are all the different ways, right? Like how would you get on top of it? How would you get off of it? Like how might you, like would you just stand on top of it, or would you sort of like grip to the side of it?
A big part of gameplay engineering is also design. I live mostly in the design world day to day, or at least earlier on in the project. And I know for your discipline, you have to be a good designer as well as a good engineer. And I think something that I've noticed that really helps too is for like game feel and other things like that, you have an animation background as well. So I think those things combined make it so that you can fill in the gaps and make decisions about when you're given high level direction or even lower level direction. Like you are still filling in many gaps of how does this function. You're doing a lot of problem solving on the design side as you're doing problem solving on the code side. We definitely problem solved this guy for a moment. This was just, this is like the normal Unreal robot that you get in UE4, and this was beyond just like cool dancing. What was this an example of, Max?
I mean, this was like our early experiments in making sure that like we could take sort of the kinematics that we were doing with the level and then skin it like with artwork. Right. So we took the generic like sort of crash test dummy Unreal character.
It does look like a crash test dummy. That's true.
Yeah, and then like we basically just sort of like this was sort of the early test of like skinning on top of like the rig tool, which is like our augmented level editor that has the ability to have these sort of giant puppets that parts of the level can be attached to.
All right.
Okay.
So I'm going to get ahead here. This is Baby taking their first steps. When we had this whole giant rig tool set up that you had made, joints and all, and now it's walking. Again, through code rather than hand animation or keyframes or things like that, correct?
Yeah, I mean, basically what we were thinking about here was like starting to think about how like a giant character understands the environment. Because like when you're that big, you don't want to be thinking about like every little tree and pebble and like crate and stuff. You kind of like want to work at a higher level.
Yeah.
But like that's sort of like too much information to sort of deal with efficiently in the computer. And so part of the way that we would set up levels with the idea that like a giant character would be interacting with the level is placing hints all over the levels. So in that case, like as the character is trying to take steps and stuff, it can see that there's actually like that the level designers have placed hints on where it would like the feet to come down, and then it's adjusting its locomotion in real time to try and respect those hints. And that's sort of like one of our tools, like for once the environments get more elaborate and stuff, for like maintaining the theater that they're navigating this big space to do all sort of technical complexity of that.
Yeah, and so this is when the tool kind of started to come together more holistically. There's some camera hinting happening here to keep track of the enemy that you're supposed to be focusing on. It's backing away and doing some strafing. It actually has an attack that can damage you. You can see Rey when she was on fire at one point, which we didn't keep the on fire stuff. This feels like it's kind of a culmination of many things, right? Working together for the first time in the engine.
Yeah, sort of the three pillars here are just like there's the character control and like not just getting that feeling good, but like getting feeling good like at speed, like really ramping her up to like 45, 50, 60 miles an hour. Also having like an extremely dynamic camera. So you can see in this case, like there's lots of like not just the player, but there's other hints in the scene of stuff that we would like to frame.
When we say hints, that means that we have other controls outside of the player themselves manually using camera, because there are definitely points where you want the player to have more control and points where you want to have less control, and it's always kind of a challenging balance to get those right, because micromanaging a camera is a lot to ask when you're trying to focus on action. So I know camera has been a particular pain for us. So yeah, please go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, like, so we're not just sort of like authoring totally custom cameras or like totally curating every different scene. Like we kind of just wanted it to like work.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, there's sort of like hints that have been activated on the Remnant, like the big guy's like body, that were like, hey, we'd like to be able to see this. And so, like, those are sort of being taken into account the like primary input from the player is like the right stick, in which you're choosing the camera direction, and we're not yanking the camera direction away from you. So like the things that we have to control are like how far away is the camera from the player, how is the player framed, right? Like you can see here, she's framed at the extreme bottom of the screen, and as like her relative position moves to the left and the right of the remnant, like she's sort of swinging to the left hand side of the screen and the right hand side of the screen. And as you pitch the camera, those sort of distances and framing is like modulated. And we're just sort of like doing our best to create like a cinematic framing of the moment, but like not taking the control away and not just like having it feel like, oh yeah, this is a AAA game where they have like a canned camera in this moment. Like it
Or
always
they
just
have
sort of like
dozens of
works.
cameras in
Yeah.
that because they, with AAA, they have entire teams to work on, or like several dedicated people to just work on camera, and we don't have that advantage. So
Yeah.
we're gonna move through these images a little faster now because we got a lot to get through. Um,
Yeah.
so this guy, you want to speak about him briefly? What's going on in the scene?
Yeah, well, this was sort of like one of our early, sort of like technical milestones where we went from just like experimenting with different animation technology to finally like figuring out our algorithm and deciding that we were going to do like a full body solver. So that's a thing where like you're not just, in addition to having all the different parts, right? Like there's a control for the left hand and the right hand and a control for the head, and a control for the hips. There's also like sort of like all the different parts are also pushing and pulling on each other, and so like as it is lifting up its limbs, it's counterbalancing that. As you hit it and you hit it with a force, it needs to sort of like understand that force to do the hit reaction, and then that has feedback in the limbs, and it just like generally is like making sure that like the character, like in addition to being like functional and putting all of its sort of key body parts in key places at the right time, it also has like good sort of like posing, and there's sort of like the feel as though it was like intentionally animated,
Right.
but still like keeping all of that like mostly procedural.
Yeah.
So
And then we have this Goofus over here, with its dozen plus legs.
yeah, well, we're like really trying to stress test like how far we could go.
It's pretty silly looking, but I love this poor creature. It's a sad, terrible creature that needs to be put out of its misery. But it is going over. Maybe you can't see it well on the stream, but it's going over some variation of height in the actual terrain, which is a complicated thing to solve for. Correct?
Yeah. Um, you can sort of see like underneath all of its feet are those little green sort of like debug wireframes that are just showing like what each of the foot is thinking, right? So it has this sort of like target location that it's queried from the physics system, and then it's sort of leapfrogging over that, as the main body moves, right, to produce the steps. And so this is just sort of going to show how like each of the different parts of the enemy has its own sort of logic and intelligence. But then there's also like, as some of those steps are going, like they're having feedback on the body where like the body is starting to like list and turn and stuff. And then that sort of affects the other feet. And like the technical challenge is making sure there isn't like a feedback loop, but that it all just sort of like resolves to a good looking like animation pose.
And we also had a lot of eyeballs on the creatures at that point too. So I'm going to move on here when we've got our little, centipede or whatever peed that you want to call it, walking around on a curved surface, on a sphere, much like a Mario Galaxy thing. At this point, I think we had gotten past some of the complexities that we were initially doing, and we were able to successfully put it on a different gravity surface. Gravity is a thing in our game that we screw around with here and there. Do you want to speak to that for a bit, Max? Ooh.
Yeah, I mean, like, So, in our games, you go sideways, you go upside down. There's like gravity ramps. There's like moons like this, in which sort of the gravity is radially pointed inward. Um, and then there's like gravity like on the remnants themselves as well. And so there's basically just like sort of like that's not something that the Unreal Engine does natively. It kind of just assumes that up is up.
Right.
And so we had to like build that into the character controller, that they were aware of the gravity. We had to build it into the camera, that it could be aware of gravity and that it can smoothly change between different gravities.
Yeah.
And then like we had to go through all of the procedural animations and sort of the puppet controls for the remnants and make them aware of gravity too. Right. And what's extra tricky about them is that different parts of their body will be experiencing different gravities. Right. So you actually have to think about how much gravity is bending the character as well when you're trying to think about steps and stuff.
It's got to curve around. Here we have a more fleshed out, literally and figuratively, version of that creature, and this is a demonstration of it kind of following along and again being driven from the animation side entirely through code, entirely through inverse kinematics, correct?
Yeah. Well, so the pose of the character is entirely based on like sort of procedural animation and kinematics and stuff. But then sort of the next level up is just sort of like how do you control a character like that? And so this is
control a character like that.
Like this is just sort of like the sort of term of art is like navigation. Basically setting goals where like I'd like to be in this place or I'd like to be facing in this direction. But those are like sort of things that you ask the remnant to do and then it has to resolve it. So you don't just say like snap over here, you say like I'd like you to be over here, and then subject to its locomotion and stuff, it gets over there.
It's got to get there eventually.
Yeah, and so sort of the next task after you get all of the sort of like the posing of the character working is to figure out like, okay, well, what are its goals, right? Like what's the sort of like decision tree where it decides where it wants to be, or like when it's interacting with you or not interacting with you and stuff like that. So just sort of the layers in the onion.
All right, so we're going to jump to a new section. We're going to talk about camera for a little bit. So we did some wild stuff with gravity. You might not want to look at this too long because it's kind of wonky and it might make you a little funny in the stomach. But this is some F0X level stuff. You want to speak to camera and kind of we talked about gravity a little bit. What's going on in this GIF, Max?
Yeah, I mean this is sort of like our earliest experiments, like several years ago, and like this was like basically what we have. Like if you look in the background, you can sort of see the horizon is a bit lighter, but then as soon as you start sort of running on this tube, right, it has gravity that's sort of always sucking you into the center of the tube. And so we were just sort of playing with the idea that like the camera can swing around and there's some smoothing on how much it swings, and that like your input doesn't really foreshorten or anything. But like sort of the case on that one is that there's sort of like too much movement if it's tracking you perfectly. So this was sort of like version 2, right, where we're like, okay, gravity's changing, and like the camera's horizon is like not going to get too far away from the gravity, but it's going to get far enough to like let you be sideways or whatever.
Right. The thing,
which gives you a lot less camera movement. Sort of like you can sort of see as she goes around the side of the cubes, the camera isn't like going totally buck wild, and it's generally pretty stable.
We found that.
But the issues that you are seeing is that like over time the camera just sort of becomes cattywampus. That's due to a complicated math thing. It's called holonomy. Like if you imagine that you're like holding a globe in your hands, and then you like turn it 90 degrees to look at the North Pole, and then you turn it 90 degrees to go back to the equator, and then you turn it 90 degrees back to where you were looking the first time, like you're back where you started, but your hands went from being on the sides to being on the top and the bottom. Um,
Right.
so like the practical effect of this is just like as the camera is moving around and like trying to follow these different horizons, it's going to just sort of like start to creep, and it's just going to start getting in these weird Dutch angles and stuff. And that kind of can make you feel seasick, like the whole world is kind of like cockeyed. And so,
Hey, Max.
like, this was sort of a success in the sense that, like, the camera was a lot more stable, but it was, like, less successful in the sense that it would sort of get stuck at these awful angles. And so ultimately, we had to, like, have sort of another system, which is, like, the horizon hint, which is, like, all things being equal, what the camera would like to be. And then every time the camera rotates, it combines the rotation to, like, match the character with another rotation to try and like resist losing the horizon as much as possible. But like doing both those rotations sort of at the same time so that it's not like swimmy all the time, but it's pretty snappy.
All right, one second. Max, you can't hear me, can you?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, something funky was going on. I've been trying to jump in there a couple of times. Is my audio coming through to you?
Yep.
Okay.
Clear now.
Okay. We're gonna move on from this and hope that we don't have any other technical issues. Fun times. All right. So I'm gonna go through a few more of these real quick, and we're gonna go on blazing speed here. So this was kind of the first attempt at spherical gravity, right? That we had in the game early on. Again, you can see Ray's model is very crude. You know, she has her cool windsock for her hair. Very stylish and in vogue. But Max, we talked a bit about spherical gravity already. Is there anything else that you wanted to tag here real briefly before I move on from this one?
No, I mean, like at this point, our character was handling the gravity like really strong. It was just figuring out sort of different ways for the camera to follow along with you. Like in this version, we were just saying like, well, okay, sort of the ground should always be facing up, right? So we won't rotate the camera unless you're sort of like foreshortening it into the horizon or you're dropping sort of below the center of the screen. But yeah, this was like mainly just sort of different camera tests on like how crazy is it if like you see the player being sideways sometimes, or you see her being right side up other times. Like, is that okay if it means that the camera moves less, or should we like move the camera more just to make it sort of easier for you to understand?
Right. Okay.
So,
and so here we started to get a little bit more wild with some of the connective bits on gravity that you could do.
yeah, we were thinking about like pillars that would meet at like joints because those are sort of like a good proxy for like the arms of the really big remnants that you would be ultimately traversing on.
Right.
And so like we were just sort of like making sure if you go on the outside of a turn or if you go on the inside of a turn, that it would always just kind of like sort of work out and make sense, and that it wouldn't be like introducing sort of like crazy rotations that would sort of like make you seasick.
Right.
Um,
Because that was a very real problem, is making the player sick. When you start to do a lot of stuff with camera, that can happen pretty easily. We've learned that lesson over and over throughout the course of development. There's a lot of cool ideas, but there's only so much you can do because there's limitations to how much you can shift the horizon at any given time, like how tight a shape can be. You know, there's like a certain circumference that ends up being really relevant. So let me switch over here again to some different areas. Let's jump into some localism. Actually, what time is it? It's 3:39. Okay, we're getting there. Let's go back into some of the unused. Yeah, let's go to localism a bit. We'll talk about a couple of these and what that means for our game. Max, do you want to give like a very brief idea of what you mean when you say localism?
Oh, so like when you land on like a moving platform, like in a game, like we usually say that you're in a local simulation, right? So you can see here I called this scene Galloping Gertie.
Mm-hmm. It's very
After the
gallopy.
Tacoma Narrows Bridge.
Very,
But
very gallopy.
but it's this idea that like it's as though you stepped into a scene that is entirely happening on top of that surface, right? So you know, uh, rather than you moving around, you think about like the whole world's moving around, but you're stationary relative to that world, right? So like, if I was to jump, right, like the platform isn't going to like pop out underneath me, right? So like once I'm within the local simulation of like a platform, like you want to like stay local to that until you move to like a different platform. And this is a thing which is like there's some like limited support for it in Unreal, but at the speeds that we were going, like these crazy fast rotations and like this idea of like I'm not just going at 45 miles an hour, but I'm running down the back of a train that's moving 90 miles an hour. Like even the smallest amount of inaccuracy can cause you to go like flying
Yeah.
off of it.
So
Um,
here we had a kind of earlier view of all those things together. We had showed when we first had the green version of this guy in there, and had an attack and was looking at the character, paying attention, and now we've kind of combined some elements where you're actually on the surface of this creature and climbing it, which was a big accomplishment early on for us. Do you want to comment on this for a bit, Max?
Yeah, I mean, this was just sort of like an all cylinders prototype where you just take all the individual elements that you've been building and just put them together. So, like, all the like local simulation sort of volumes and colliders, all of the sort of gravity producing stuff, all of the sort of like camera hints and things, like they're all attached right to the remnant and they're all like in motion and like happening, and so like you can actually traverse around its body. um and so like we were really focused on saying like what's the complete game loop, like where do you start, how do you progress the game, and then how does the game finish, and then in the course of going through that loop, how do you interact with all the sort of like pieces of the game.
Right.
um
And then we started putting even more pieces together. This is a much later
yeah.
version showcasing gravity, showcasing, this kind of large grotesque creature with more thematically bringing together the things that we're doing that we've showcased in trailers. This one's not moving at the moment, but I think the interesting thing here is how the camera moves and how the gravity works and how the character control all makes that possible. Let's jump to one more thing here. Okay. Go back. We'll go back. No more dancing cubes. Sorry. Let's go to the rest of our unused prototypes. That's going to be a fun thing to talk about real quick. And then we can get into some other details on you, Max. All right. So, what do we have here? Who's this? Oops, I jumped ahead. This was a version from like 2017, I think. Right, Max?
Yeah, I think so. Um, yeah. Sorry, I think I'm having some audio technical difficulties.
Oh, can you hear me all right?
Yeah. Oh wait, I think I can hear you now.
Okay.
So yeah, like you can sort of see this was sort of an evolution on before where they were taking very simple locomotion steps in a row. Now we have it sort of very intelligently being able not just to like walk in a straight line or along a path, but to be able to do navigation, but also like respect all the hints that we've placed for like where its feet can go,
Yeah.
so that it like can sort of be integrated into a level. You can also see like between the head look and the top of its body and its hips that it's like doing some simple physics like calculations to try and make sure that it's always staying balanced. And so,
Seeing it now years later, it looks like it's uh, looks like it's wearing a fanny pack.
yeah. But it's also sort of like starting to get to the place where like we're having to compromise on how much you would like how evocative or high fidelity you'd like the animation to be,
Right.
because the character has to move smooth enough for you to be able to traverse them and like make jumps and like reliably follow those jumps.
Well, there's also the trick of when you're doing humanoids, especially at a large scale. It's like, well, if you're doing IK, like we've been doing, there are ways to kind of mask that with different shapes. But anytime you do something human-like, whether it's facial animations, eyes, mouths, or just the movement of walking around and reacting in general, we know humans very well. Our brains are programmed to see and like all the different micro expressions and animations that we have in real life, and so there's definitely things that can ring false in games when it comes to creature animation if it's humanoid. So that's always the big risk here. Luckily, we try and mask a lot of that with some of the more grotesque stuff we do, and the fact that it's a science fantasy thing, so it doesn't have to be as effective on that front to be, everything that you need it to be for it to look completely human or convincing, because it's not supposed to be convincing. It's supposed to be creepy, ultimately. Let's get
Yeah.
into... Ooh, yeah, that stinger guy. Okay. Yeah, this little goober, we who was jumping and leaping around, and was still built with the rig tool and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. So I mean, like this is sort of like an avenue not taken, right? Where we were thinking about having like a broad range of how big they could be. So
Mm-hmm.
you can have the level scale ones, and then you can also have some that are sort of like more at like what you may think of like as like a mini boss scale. And so just sort of like trying to like push the solutions that we already had, in order to see how far we can take it. And this is sort of like one of those things where it's like it's interesting in its own right,
Right.
but in terms of like the whole picture of the entire game, like it wasn't really sort of like emphasizing what we wanted to emphasize, which
Right.
was sort of extreme differences in scale. So
That's
that's just sort of the reality of game development, which is that like when you like play a game and you look at it and you see like 10 features and you're like, oh, I could have made those 10 features, but like each of those features, for each thing that makes it into the game, there's two or three things that you tried out and like either it wasn't in scope or it like sort of unbalanced, sort of sitting next to everything else, or like it's cool but just not cool for this game or whatever.
right. We
um,
definitely had our share of experiences on that front, where a lot is left on the cutting room floor, like Max was saying, for a variety of reasons. And I know here, when we were kind of testing out this like race against a particular NPC that we had, there's some cool stuff here. It was a good experiment. It felt promising, but ultimately, as over the course of development, we ended up cutting this particular feature. We integrated parts of it, and you still get kind of this sensation in a lot of ways. But this explicit mode or like type of gameplay in the game ended up not making it in longer term because it didn't fit into what we were doing and the goals we were trying to achieve on a much larger scale. It was cool, but it wasn't worth the resources because we're still a small team. I think at this point we were probably hovering around 12 people, give or take, which in the grand scheme of things, trying to make a big giant 3D game is small. Even with as advanced the tools can be now, even with all the advantages that we have, we're still creating a lot of different different types of gameplay whole cloth. Max, you had redone the entire character controller from the out of the box one that Unreal provides, because there were a lot of things we wanted to do with it, and game feels very important to us. So that's just like one of the many aspects that we customized for ourselves and changed throughout the course of development. So there's a lot of that tech under the hood, and for a team of our scale, and we've definitely grown over the years, but for a team of our scale and budget and time frame and just the scale and scope and ambition of this game, there's only so much you can do. Even if you really love something, sometimes you got to let it go because it's in service of the greater good. It's in service of something that's more impactful, that's more on point to what we are ultimately looking for to convey in the game. But yeah, it was fun to race the NPC. It was cool.
Yeah. Design really is like a process of consolidation, right? Like you have to sort of like explore the space, and then you have to identify the parts of the space that are like telling the story that you want to tell, or creating the player experience that you want to create, or like accommodating the challenge that you think is like interesting.
Right.
And then like basically finding ways to like consolidate and combine stuff down to just those elements. So like,
yeah, for sure.
So like the idea of like the player needs to maintain speed, and the player needs to like race some kind of ticking clock to a waypoint was something that like this was like one approach to it. I would say that we tried 2 or 3 other approaches before we landed.
We tried a few, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, before we landed on the game loop that we're shipping.
Yeah, so. And you learn a lot by doing different prototypes. So this is us showing some fun stuff beforehand, but don't think that all of it made it in, because it certainly didn't.
Yeah. Like a lot of those remnants we were showing before, where it's like shooting at you from a distance, or where it's sort of like coming out of the acid looking at you, or the scorpion slamming its tail, like those were all like super cool, and I like loved that work.
Mm-hmm.
But like ultimately the issue was that like being on the remnants and running around their bodies was like really fun. Playtesters liked it. It was unique about our game. Whereas this idea of the approach where like, oh, you kind of need to dodge attacks from it and figure out how to get on its body just like wasn't that interesting.
Right. The compelling part of our experience were these giant creatures and being on them more than it was anything else. So that's the tough choice.
Yeah. And there's like also stuff like this where it's just like makes for like a really great look. There's like obviously a lot of like storytelling potential here, but like this remnant ain't big enough. Like we figured out that like players want to be on their body, they want to be traversing around different parts of their body, and that means that like that's 5% of how big the remnant needs to be.
This is like a toenail on one of our remnants right now. So we ended up learning a lot about our game and about the experiences that we wanted to craft by doing things like this. That's kind of like the pain and the joy of games development from my perspective, is all that work you do, even if you cut it, even if you don't, bring it to the table in the exact form that you can see here as an example, it's transformative and it builds on the experience of it all. It informs what comes next, and it helps you to like winnow down to the essentials and to distill, like have this more distilled version of the game that doesn't have to be everything, only really has to be a couple of very good things. And still elements of all these things, these different creatures and experiments that we did earlier on, made it into the game, whether it's like gripping the side or shooting things at you or the ways that it walks around. It's just scale was a bigger factor for us. Oh yeah, we had the little mini more-legged one running around on the side of this. And then we had this stuff where you could grip to it, run on the back. So yeah, you want to speak to this for a moment, Max?
Yeah, I mean, like this is basically an evolution of that hot dog we saw earlier.
This is the end game hot dog, spiky hot dog.
Yeah. Like only now, like in addition to the climbing mechanics, we'd also figured out sort of like running around on the back and like what we eventually came to call momentum transfer. Because
Mm-hmm.
this is all an allusion to the player, but basically as soon as she ledge grabs and vaults herself up onto back in sort of the beginning of this clip, she's actually entering the local simulation of that sort of white mass. And then as she's running down the back, right, because they're all articulated, she has to sort of seamlessly move between all these different local simulations, so that if you stopped at any one of these sort of back masses, you would have stable gameplay. But also as you moved between them, it was very fluid. So that was sort of important in general in terms of figuring out and proving to ourselves that we can have gameplay that's on the back of things and that's moving, and that we don't have to stop the scene every time we want to do interesting gameplay.
Right. I'm going to move on here. We got some clouds, and we have a creature moving through the clouds, which was very cool. We still maintained creatures going through clouds, but the idea that you can jump on the back and skate on it seamlessly, this moving surface versus a kind of not quite static surface, because the clouds have some movement to them as well. But this was a good juxtaposition, and I know, Max, there are some challenges here with speed change and kind of making sure that onboarding experience was seamless, right?
Yeah, it's sort of the same thing where you're running onto the back of something that, in this case, she's moving at about the character's speed, so she's moving about 30 miles an hour. But you can see, once you're on her back here, the player sort of loses the sense that they're moving, except that there's sort of spray from the clouds sort of coming in your face, going through the camera and indicating that kind of movement. But basically right there where you go from being on a static environment to being a dynamic environment and just having it work, and it's reliable, and we can build more gameplay on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of took a long time to sort of get that right, but then once we did have that right, it became sort of easier to then sort of bring the level designers back in and say okay, now put a big level on top of this character,
It's true.
because everything's just going to work, and you're not going to suddenly go flying off because the physics glitches out.
Okay. So Max, we're coming up on the end of our time for show and tell. I think it would be good to talk a little bit about. I think we're having some weirdness about your microphone, Max.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if it's okay or not, but we're getting word that you have some echo. I'll make sure that I'll find out what's going on. But in the meantime, let's keep going, assuming that we'll fix this. Let me try and fix it. But I guess I have some remaining questions for you, and then we have questions for us on folks on the chat that I want to get to and spend a few minutes on. So, Max, I think a question that comes to some people's minds are, if there's a recommendation about how to get into the industry, if maybe you're a hobbyist or even just generally interested, what's your recommendation on if you want to become a gameplay programmer, for example, because you are a gameplay programmer, not necessarily how do they follow your path, but if you have any pointers or tips or, things you want to educate on or knowledge to share on kind of the trials and tribulations and getting into the industry and doing what you do now, I think that'd be a salient set of info to share.
Sure. There's no one path. Certainly. I know some people have gone through sort of college. I know people who have come straight out of high school and gone into games. I just think more than ever before, all the tools are available. You can download the Unreal Game Engine. You can download Unity. You can find all the sort of compilers and tools that you might want to sort of just like build stuff natively. But like the most important, I think, thing is just like being able to find an audience. And so I know like a lot of people like do a lot with like social media, and that's a good way to start getting sort of feedback on your work. For me, what was really helpful was there's a there's an event called Ludum Dare at like ldjam.com now, which is a sort of like it's like sort of quarterly a bunch of like game jam in which people like either alone or in groups spend 48 hours to make a game on a theme that's like revealed right at the beginning of each event. And like what's cool about it is that after it's finished and everybody submitted their games, um, everybody votes on everybody else's games, and you get to vote on other games by like playing them, and also your game gets shown to other people if you play other people's games. So like there's like an incentive built in for everybody to actually play everybody else's games and give each other feedback.
It's true.
And so like I think that's like a really great thing where it's like people who like otherwise might not be inclined to like see a cool project that you've been posting about and like look it up, like will still like sort of like play your game. And so you're not just getting like feedback from people who are already enthusiastic about what you're doing, but you're getting like a big slice of people. And because they're also developers, like they're really good at giving you pointers and tips, and like it's just like, you know, the best way to learn is just by doing. I'm like a big advocate of like just to like get into the engine and just make it work, and then get it in front of people who like don't know what you're trying to do, and ask them if they can figure out what you're trying to do, you know. Just sort of like just like making things and then getting feedback from people.
It's important to get feedback. If you don't, then you're just in a silo and you don't know what your project is necessarily worth to other people either, you know, how interesting and engaging it can be. So I think that's good advice. Thank you, Max. Let's answer some questions here. Accepted Sugar. What's up? Can you still hear me, Max?
Yep.
Okay. Accepted Sugar asks, how is the difficulty? I loved the challenge of Hyperlight, and I'm hoping the movement/enemies are similar. So different game in many ways. You can see that we focus heavily on traversal, platforming, all sorts of wild stuff that we've shown today from our early prototype days that can definitely make you a little seasick. But ultimately, because it's a different game, you know, I wouldn't say that you're going to be playing the same way you would with Hyperlight. Obviously, with big giant creatures, obviously with kind of the character speed and all that. There's different types of challenges, like mentally, that you have to face here. So just controlling the character and understanding the scale and where to go next, and in a 3D environment, is a lot to ask for a player. You know, with Drifter, it's overhead, it's a fixed view, it's 2D. There's no real camera work that you're doing. As soon as you introduce that element, and especially at our character speeds and scale, it becomes more challenging. So I will say you can adjust difficulty. So if you find our game a little too easy, you can certainly ratchet it up and make it super hard for yourself. It can become very hard. I think our baseline is going to be a little more challenging than not. But again, 3D, camera movement, third person, big giant creatures, super fast character, just like a different set of things that you have to consider when it comes to difficulty. So it's not a one-to-one comparison. Celia, Fallen Dream, asks, is Solar Ash open world? I would say it's not open world in the sense that you may be thinking, like a Far Cry or whatever. But it definitely has big spaces, big zones. But it's kind of like a linear, narrow to wide space where you can do plenty of stuff in whatever order of operations you want, depending on the biome you're in. So not open world, but it is big, and there are elements of openness that make it feel more open world than not. So speaking of the right stick, how well does it play with keyboard controls? Max, what do you think? Do you play with keyboard controls much?
Not as much. but like definitely on the team, there's been like people who are like devotees of mouse and keyboard, and so it's definitely not the thing where we're like, oh right, PCs, we have to start doing that after the fact. It's been sort of like on our radar, sort of throughout development. Like in some cases, it's a bit like easier because obviously you can like twitch the mouse a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I don't know. It's designed for both.
It's designed for both.
We definitely there were some choices we would have liked to make, which would have like really locked us into gamepads, and we sort of like walked back from going those directions.
I think it's important to support both, especially since we know how many people love keyboard and mouse. For me, I used to love keyboard and mouse, but these days I use it all day long. So coming back to like relaxing and then using a keyboard and mouse to relax, not ideal. I go to gamepad even for first-person shooters these days, which was blasphemy years ago for me. All right, so Felix Tron and Alien asks, will there be Easter eggs or nods to Hyperlight in Solar Ash? I mean, here's the thing. It's not a directly related series, but it's still a game from us, from Heart Machine. There's still a lot of those threads that you can clearly see from the trailers, screenshots, whatever else that we've done, and just stylistically, there will be, sure, little nods to kind of the themes that we really focus on at the studio ultimately. So we'll see how many things people find that are like true nods or not to Drifter. All right, Rogue Keychain. It's a good name. Remnants, as in Remnants of Judgment. I'm assuming you're talking about the final boss from Drifter. No relation to Judgment. Judgment is its own creature. These are just remnants of things you'll find out when you play the game. Extremely Wrecked. I just want to know if we can abuse the engine and game mechanics to get insane speed. I think one of the things I'm most looking forward to, and Max, I want to understand your perspective on this too, is speedrunning. Our game is very fast. There's some physics-based bits in here. We have limiters on things, so it doesn't crash the game on certain platforms. But I'm really interested to see how people break it. So I'll just say I don't know, because we haven't had those exploits internally beyond some bugs that we find that will like actually crash the game. But yeah, I would love to see how fast people can go, and if they can break the game to get extreme speeds on things. I'm sure there's going to be something in there, because again, there's almost always a way to do something weird with games like this, where there's plenty of things that aren't perfect about collision in this, and that we haven't, as a small team, had time to tune exactly. So I would suspect there's going to be some fines in here about our character control and speeds that affect speed running in general. But Max, you programmed it. You tell me if you think that there's a possibility for that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, like floating point numbers, like on computers, are just notoriously bad when you're doing highly integrated things. But like, I definitely know that we've like acknowledged speedrunning pretty much through the entire development of the project. So like, there are sort of multiple solutions, like to some of the traversal puzzles, which like you gotta get good before you can sort of like do the leader tricks, which I'm not that good, but I get the privilege to work with designers who have sort of like figured it out, and then we've kind of leaned into a few of those. So there are some like, there's like a baseline of play, and then there's like a next level strategy. So.
Yeah, definitely. Neither you nor I am the best player on the team at this game. I think those titles go to other folks, a couple of other folks above us. I think I'm pretty middling at it as far as skill level goes, because I have a million other things to focus on, but it's also other people are just better at games than me, so I'm not that type of get good unless it comes to like Smash Brothers. That's all I can say. Okay, so Felix Tron mentions the soccer kid, and this being the soccer kid from the future. You know, if that's what convinces you to have a good time in here, then yes, please. It's definitely the soccer kid from Drifter. Um, the game Gamentor, Gamentor. I don't know how to pronounce that. How do you feel about the very first trailer from 2019? Do you think it's representative of the game? I think early trailers are always going to have some stuff in it that doesn't make it in, or is going to be tonally perhaps not quite as on point as later trailers and as the final game ends up being. So I would say that it is representative in many respects, but obviously if I was going to go back in time and do that trailer again with assets that we have now, it'd be a different thing. But I'm still fond of it. I think it still gave a particular vibe that was engaging, but things change over the course of 4 years of development for sure. And I think I always find it fascinating in games, watching different trailers or watching sneak peeks at things, or the kind of postmortems that you see at GDC or whatever else. I love seeing how a game has changed over the course of development, like what features were dropped, what things worked and why they didn't. One of my favorite prized possessions as a kid, because I subscribed to Nintendo Power, and they gave out this, I forget if they just mailed it to people. They might have just mailed it to people as a free promotional gift, but it was like the most important thing to me for a year, was this Donkey Kong Country videotape in a really cool leafy pre-rendered dust jacket. And it was behind the scenes. It showed those massive machines that they used. What were they? Like the CG? I forget what they're called. I don't want to say it wrong, but they had those massive boxes that were like the size of a refrigerator to help render out all the graphics for DKC. And it was fascinating. It was like one of the first looks that I got into how games are made way back in the day. And so I fucking loved that thing. I watched that tape so many damn times because it just, process always fascinates me, which is why I love talking about this stuff and talking to people about this stuff. But yeah, I went on a bit of a tangent there. Max, here's another question. So, would you consider lack of a college degree to be a large barrier for getting into game development in general? Lemonworm asks. I'm going to give a really brief answer and say, fuck no. Max, what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Certainly, I've worked with lots of people who only had high school degrees or even dropped out and just did GEDs.
Yep.
Which, if you know it's what you want to do, then you can certainly focus in that way. But I will say it definitely is easier, for people who are sort of in major metropolitan areas, like if you're around Los Angeles, to find more opportunities. It's going to be harder, if you're trying to sort of build a career without credentials and you're remote.
Yeah.
So in that case, you really need to focus on your craft and have just
Yep.
a really good demo reel.
Exactly.
And a really good online presence. So, there's no shortcut to doing the work. It's just the work takes a different form in different cases.
Very well said. I've done a lot of interviews over the past bunch of years that Heart Machine has been open, and rarely do the credentials matter ultimately. They're a first step in some ways where it's cool, sure, that's great. What I care about, I think what most recruiters care about, is basically what Max is saying, is what is your body of work? Have you shipped games before? If not, do you have your own projects that you're working on? You have a demo reel you can show? Especially when it comes to engineering, if you can showcase that you know an engine well, that you care about the craft of making games, and that you have some demo that people can play, even if it's relatively simple, there's a lot that an employer can glean from that. And it shows that you have initiative and an independent streak, and you're good at self-managing. Same thing that anybody would tell you with an art portfolio. It's it doesn't, I for artists, like, I don't care at all about the school that you've gone to. Credentials don't are like meaningless when it comes to certain disciplines, or relatively speaking meaningless. It's just, what does your portfolio look like? That's the end game here. And so certain institutions are great to go to because, again, like Max was saying, that's how you get that experience and build that portfolio. That's how you learn. But if you learn better on your own, if you want to go and be an indie dev and like make really cool things that you can later leverage to get into a bigger studio scenario, that's a perfectly valid and an incredible path. It's just, again, well said, Max. It's about doing the work, and you got to do it one way or another. Okay. Will there be an option to hide the HUD? Not at the moment, but we'll discuss it. We're still doing those types of last minute, gameplay accessibility features and things. Will this be as silent of a story as HLD? I saw some dialogue being voiced, and a major component of HLD for me was the show don't tell method. So that's a good question. We actually have VO in this game, and it's a pretty big change for us, for the better in a lot of ways for this game. There's a lot of show don't tell already, so I would expect to kind of get your fill of that, but also be introduced to what some of the very talented people who voiced over our characters are capable of. Can we go beyond the max default speed by precise use of movement, like b-hopping in old id Tech and source engines? I want to go fast. We kind of already answered this question, and Max, the answer was...
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, the biggest trick is basically to time when you jump off of moving platforms, because they'll throw you at like way faster than your thrust speed. So it's my pro tip.
Emily Juliet asks, what's your favorite type of tasks to work on? Like procedural locomotion, player character control, big new features, etc. This is a absolutely 100% you question, Max.
Yeah, I mean, I have an animation background. It's like what I went to school for. So like I'm definitely susceptible to getting nerd sniped by like game feel and like juice. Yeah, that's when like you're working on something because you like to work on it and not because it's like necessarily important or like the most high priority thing.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I like any of that stuff where like you're thinking about like the weight or the movement or like the cinematography of the scene, like just anything that anything that like really pushes like the drama or like the epicness of like how you're feeling, right? Because that's sort of like I think what I like in games like with controls is just like how expressive they are, like how much you can sort of like give the character personality by how you're driving them. And so sort of finding like a way to create depth for that is like sort of where I'm interested in. It's my favorite stuff.
Very important. Expressivity and controls.
Unfortunately, a lot of game dev is fixing bugs.
That's true. That's true, especially at the tail end, like right now.
That's what you spend most of your time doing.
How many bugs are you fixing today, Max? Oh, Max, you can't hear me. Oh.
Sorry if I talked over you there. I think there's like a delay.
Yeah.
But
imperfect. It's fine.
I'm closing about a dozen a day.
Hey, there we go. How was the name Ray decided for our protagonist? I had a lot of different names for different characters, including the main character. It just kind of came down to that's what was most fitting overall. For a lot of different reasons, including a bit of a nod to Ray from Evangelion. So there's definitely a bit of that. You can see I have an Eva figure over there. So clearly I like Evangelion. A lot of us do. All right. How do you schedule playtest time in the studio, and how do you act on feedback? Usually we ask a lot of friends. We ask people that we trust to start off, and we just try and do it in an afternoon sometime whenever it's generally convenient for both parties to do it. That's how we did it with Drifter. That's how we've done it here with Solar, at least in the initial stages. With Solar, though, we've gotten a lot more serious because it's a bigger game, bigger budget, a lot of things, and by virtue of the scale of things, we just need more in-depth testing. So really, we have external teams. And we've done a lot of internal stuff with friends and other folks like that, close dev friends, whatever. But longer term, those external studios that specialize in QA become really important. And there's a whole process there for scheduling that I will not get into here. But it's quite a thing. QA and bug fixing and all that stuff and kind of the final mile that we're in that a lot of games get into. It is a challenging time to catch your breath because there's just mountains of things to do. And it's kind of that old truism or whatever you want to call it of like the last 10% is 90% of your time, or I forget what it is actually. But basically that home stretch, those like handful of last months take up so much time and effort, and you wish that you had gotten there like a year before, because if only I had that time. But doesn't seem to be the way that it ever really works for most. So, Vsauce Puppet asks, I'm going to be starting college in 2 weeks, and I'm pretty nervous. I'm hoping to do work in game design course. Any tips for someone who wants to be a concept artist? Oh, I mean, Max, this is a question for you too, because you went into animation as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping to do like technical animation, which is sort of like setting up the tools for the animators, right? Making the puppets rather than being the puppeteer.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't really have that much experience, but
I will say,
the only advice I can give is if you can also code, everybody will want you to join.
yeah, learning to code is really is a great thing to do, regardless of what discipline you're going to be in. Learn to program. Can't recommend that enough, because even if you don't really love it, at least you'll understand it. And if you're going into games, the more you understand about other disciplines, the better off you'll be. So, that to me, that's kind of the best advice I'll give you. Specifically for concept art, there's so much, but I think the best one is keep exploring. Don't get locked into any one style yet, or try not to. Not to say it can't work, but broadly applicable for a lot of people is like experiment. Like school is the time for you to go wild and figure out really what your limits are. Like, what do you hate making and what do you love making? And dig into the stuff that you really love, and get rid of the stuff that you don't. And don't worry about failing, because you will fail at things in school. You'll have bad projects. You'll have bad deliverables. You'll panic. You'll do all sorts of weird stuff. Like, it happens, but that's the safe space to do that shit. So just like be prepared to screw up and understand that that's a good thing. That's a good part of the process to fuck it up and be like, this was the worst project I've ever delivered. As long as you're putting in the work in and learning lessons, you're good. All right. Will this game have its own physical edition? And will this game have a deluxe edition, official OST, digital art book, etc.? Don't know yet. Can't comment on it yet. Those are questions for Annapurna and our publisher when we all kind of agree on that stuff. At launch, we're going to keep it pretty simple with digital edition of this game, but we'll see. All those things are possible. Solar Ash, does it utilize some of the unique features on the DualSense? And will it be available on the Epic Store? DualSense support on the Epic Store. That's interesting. I don't actually know if the drivers on PC are up to snuff for the DualSense. I don't know yet if it can tap into all those little fine movements and the kind of resistive trigger stuff. So I cannot comment on that one because I just don't know. But yeah, we'll have some stuff on the DualSense for PS5. That controller is really rad. I love it. So we're gonna try and do some fun stuff with it. Cactus 2 Bro, has there been a consideration for adding gyro to the game? No. I don't think we had much of a conversation around that, unless we were ever going to do it for like mobile. But gyro, did we ever talk about gyro, Max?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. And none of us are big gyro fans, I don't think. Which game was more enjoyable to make, HLD or SA? I don't think that's an answerable question. I think making games is always a beautiful. It's like that 311 song, "Beautiful Disaster." It's just it's a lot of work. It can be really enjoyable and fulfilling and incredible and empowering. And it's like you sit back and you're like, wow, I get to make video games for a living. That's fucking cool. But also, it can be really hard. And some days you're just like, what am I doing? And it's a lot of work. And boy, oh boy, trying to handle all these different aspects to consider in one package. I mean, Max, you're a gameplay person, but like, how many other disciplines do you like interact with and have to know about on any given day just to do your job?
Yeah, I mean, like you definitely learn a lot of jargon from like sort of your colleagues or like just to sort of like talk cross-disciplinary. But yeah, I mean, like games are pretty wild. Like everyone is like either the 2D versus 3D thing is very different, or like, prior to this, I had been working on Abzu, which was like meant to be a more sort of tranquil and contemplative game, not like a try real hard, fail the player, like challenge game. And so there's just like, you sort of like develop like different interests and like what's unique about the different projects.
Yep.
So,
All right. We'll kind of flash through these because we're coming up on time here. Will there be mappable buttons and rumble options? Will there be equipable costumes similar to HLD? And do programmers and environmental design arts need to work closely together during development? The answer to all three of these is yes. On the last one in particular, from Rusty Rose Gear Chrono, quite a name. Do programmers and environment design arts need to work closely together during development? I mean, yeah, like Max was saying, and like we were alluding to, all the disciplines need to talk to each other at some point. You can't just live in your department and disappear on a team of this scale. I think when you get to a certain size, like Ubisoft teams spread across the world or whatever, yeah, some people get siloed for sure. They have layers of management or other senior folks or whatever. But for us, for this team, everyone just got to talk to everyone at some point. It's unavoidable. You're gonna have a conversation by virtue of us just being in the same room over and over each day. Not during the pandemic, of course, but before that and even now, it's just like we have breakout groups, sure. We have like our departments, sure, but a lot of our initiatives are cross-discipline. So it's like Max has to be there for it, Chelsea has to be there for it. Several other people from that represent a particular discipline have to be there in order to like get a lot of tasks done. And I think that's why making games is so hard a lot of the time, and why, it's not a recommended career path unless you're truly passionate about this stuff, because of the difficulty, because it's non-linear, because of that element of interactivity that makes certain things just wildly unpredictable. Films and other linear media are known quantities in a lot of ways. You can lay down a path and know what you're going to get from it 100% of the time. But with a game, you're relying on like guides or guardrails to some extent. And unless you're an extremely linear game, even then you can't rely on the player doing exactly what you want them to do. They're still going to miss inputs. They're still going to like search for a thing that you think is obvious. They're still going to observe something else that you didn't think was all that interesting, but this lamppost is interesting to them. And now they've like broken whatever magical pacing that you had. Like a movie can say like the pacing is going to be exactly this. I'm going to put this music to it, whatever else. A game has to, even in the most linear format, account for the player has control. They set the pacing. So if they want to walk across the entire map, or if they want to walk instead of run because that's how they want to do it on this linear side-scrolling stage, and you wanted audio to sync up perfectly with it, there's a lot of other things that you have to consider just to get that to work. So yeah, games are hard to make, and I think we'll kind of wrap it up here. Max, thank you for joining up here on the interview side. It was lovely to hear about this stuff. It was great to show some old experimental stuff. it brings back fond memories of the hot dog, the floating hot dog, and the dancing IK robot, and this power slide feature that was cool. Are there any closing thoughts that you had before we pop on out of here? Anything that you wanted to share, or kind of parting words of wisdom for folks?
I just hope people really enjoy the game. Uh, Lots of people work real hard on it. And like, we definitely tried to like find areas of games that are usually sort of underexplored and just sort of like go a little ham on those. So like, hope that we succeeded well enough that people found something new in it if they haven't seen it in other games. So
Well said. All right, Max. Great speaking to you. I hope everyone who watched enjoyed this. If you got any feedback, suggestions, other things that you are interested in learning about, disciplines, whatever else, please, send stuff to our official Twitter account, which is listed right there at the bottom of the page. Like and subscribe and all that jazz. We'll be back, maybe not this week, but next week with another interview. We're gonna keep these going on as regular a pace we can. So yeah, stock up your questions, talk to your friends about this stuff. Again, if you want to learn about how games are being made and what the roles are and what we experience as developers, here's the place to come and glean some of that background knowledge. So thanks for everybody hanging with us. Thanks for working through our bit of our technical difficulties. And we'll see you all next time. Goodbye.